He came to fix her broken refrigerator, but the quiet intimacy of her apartment ignited an unexpected spark. When he said he was leaving, she closed the door and whispered, "Too late." What happened next, neither of them could unlive. The relentless, high-pitched whine of the old refrigerator in apartment 14B, perched on the fourth floor of the sprawling Orchard Vista residences in the quiet suburb of Meadowbrook, had become Elara Thorne's personal tormentor. For weeks it had been a monotonous, almost sentient hum, a mechanical companion that amplified the profound silence of her rarely disturbed life. It was a sound that had woven itself into the fabric of her days, a constant reminder of the solitary existence she had meticulously crafted. When the hum finally stuttered, coughed like a dying beast, and then collapsed into an ominous, echoing silence, taking with it the last fragile vestiges of cold from the failing appliance, Elara felt a peculiar blend of weariness and a strange, almost liberating finality. It was yet another small, irreparable break in a life that seemed punctuated by them. She had tried the familiar rituals of appeasement, unplugging, plugging back in, a desperate, almost superstitious tap on its side, even a whispered plea as if the old General Electric held a soul. But the old Sentinel was truly, irrevocably gone. A new one was an immediate necessity, but more pressing, more urgent, was the silent ticking clock on the food within. This domestic crisis, seemingly mundane, was the unlikely conduit that brought Kieran Sharma, a young man barely past the threshold of his 22nd year, to her doorstep. He stood there, a vision of youthful awkwardness, a well-worn canvas toolbox clutched in one hand, a cheap plastic-bodied flashlight in the other. His introduction had come through her neighbor, the amiable but sometimes overly zealous Mr. Finch, who had, with a twinkle in his eye, lauded Kieran's burgeoning brilliance in electrical engineering and his surprising knack for fixing things. Kieran had arrived with a visible reluctance, his brow furrowed with a mild apprehension that Elara, in her quiet assessment, found oddly endearing. He usually dealt with industrial-scale systems, he'd mumbled, his voice a low rumble that surprised her, not these antiquated domestic relics. But Mr. Finch's insistence had been tenacious, and Elara, desperate, had relented. Kieran was tall, almost gangly, with a wild shock of dark, untamed hair that perpetually threatened to fall into his intelligent, hesitant eyes. Those eyes, she noticed immediately, seemed to absorb every detail of his surroundings with a quiet intensity. He was dressed simply, in a faded, oversized T-shirt emblazoned with the crest of a university Elara didn't recognize, and jeans that had clearly seen better days. He looked younger than his stated 22 years, perhaps closer to 20, a mere fledgling stepping into the vastness of adulthood. Elara, at 41, felt the accumulated weight of 2 decades and a lifetime of unspoken sorrows resting heavily upon her shoulders as she finally pulled the door wider, allowing him entry into the cool, still air of her meticulously ordered apartment. "Miss Thorne, Kieran Sharma," he offered, his voice a surprising baritone that seemed to contradict his boyish face. He didn't extend a hand, simply shifted his weight, a nervous habit, from one worn sneaker to the other. His restraint, Elara thought, was a refreshing change from the usual boisterousness of youth. "Kieran, thank you for coming. It's a bit of an emergency. All my perishables are in there." Elara gestured vaguely towards the kitchen, her voice a little more clipped than she intended, a subtle betrayer of her inner anxiety. She was a woman accustomed to fierce independence, to navigating the complexities of life unaided. Asking for help, especially from someone so young, felt like a concession, a chink in her well-built armor. He nodded, a brief, almost imperceptible dip of his head. His movements were economical, purposeful. "No problem. Mr. Finch explained the situation. Let me take a look." Elara led him into the kitchen, a space that usually hummed with the quiet, solitary domesticity of a single woman, but now felt hollowed out, eerily silent. The defunct refrigerator stood like a gleaming, white sarcophagus, its once pristine surface dulled by the passage of time. Kieran set his toolbox down with a soft, metallic thud that resonated in the quiet room, then knelt, his movements surprisingly fluid, almost graceful despite his gangliness. He pulled out a small flathead screwdriver, its tip glinting under the muted kitchen light, and began to methodically examine the compressor unit nestled at the back of the appliance. Elara found herself watching him, a strange internal alchemy of relief and unease churning within her. Relief that competent help had arrived, unease at the sudden unexpected intrusion into the carefully constructed quietude of her private world. The apartment, she knew, was a reflection of her inner landscape, sparsely furnished, a testament to a minimalist aesthetic that bordered on asceticism, and perhaps to a subtle, almost subconscious reluctance to truly plant roots. In the living room, neutral-toned sofas sat in quiet repose, a carefully curated stack of art books lay on a low-polished oak coffee table, and a single, large abstract painting adorned the wall. A tumultuous swirl of blues and grays that eerily mirrored the often stormy skies she observed from her window. There were no photographs, no sentimental trinkets, no overt displays of a shared past. Her life, by deliberate design, had become a contained, quiet orbit, an island in the bustling sea of the city. Kieran worked with a quiet diligence, a deep frown of concentration etched on his young face. He hummed a low, tuneless melody beneath his breath as he probed and poked, muttering technical terms to himself, diagnostics, current fluctuations, thermal cutoffs, words that were utterly foreign to Elara's ears. The air in the kitchen grew heavy with the faint, almost metallic scent of ozone and the fine dust stirred up by his meticulous investigation. Elara found herself studying him, observing the quiet ballet of his hands, the way his long, slender fingers moved with a surprising dexterity, the way a stubborn lock of dark hair perpetually fell across his forehead, and how he would blow it away with a soft puff of air, a gesture of almost boyish charm. He seemed entirely engrossed, utterly oblivious to her silent scrutiny. He was simply present, focused on the task at hand. After what felt like an eternity, though it was likely only a few minutes, he straightened up, wiping his hands, stained faintly with grease and dust, on the worn fabric of his jeans. "Compressor's gone, Ms. Thorne. Completely seized up. It's beyond any repair I can offer. You'll need a new unit, I'm afraid." Elara sighed, a faint, almost imperceptible puff of air escaping her lips. It was the confirmation she dreaded, yet expected. "I feared as much. What about the food? It's already been out for a while." Kieran paused, his gaze sweeping over the silent, pristine kitchen, then settling on the sealed, tomb-like refrigerator. "Do you have a cooler? Or perhaps a neighbor who might have some space in their fridge for a few hours?" "I have a large camping cooler, yes, and Mr. Finch next door might, but it's already been out for a while," she repeated, picturing her wilting lettuce, the milk undoubtedly on the precipice of turning sour. The thought brought a fresh wave of frustration. He nodded, a flicker of concern in his eyes. "Okay, let's get everything out. We can pack it in the cooler with some ice if you have any, and then I can help you move the old one out of the way. It'll make it easier for the delivery people when the new one arrives. They usually just drop it at the curb." you know. The offer was unexpected, a quiet ripple in the placid waters of her expectations. Elara was accustomed to purely transactional encounters. A repairman fixed something, you paid, they left. This genuine willingness to extend himself to offer unsolicited help felt oddly disarming. "That's very kind of you, Kieran, but you don't have to," she began, a familiar reflex of self-reliance, a lifetime of standing on her own 2 feet, asserting itself. He turned then, and for the first time, his eyes met hers fully. They were a deep, rich brown, almost the color of polished mahogany, and in their depths, Elara saw not just politeness, but a quiet, almost reserved concern. "It's no trouble, Ms. Thorne. I'm done with classes for the day. And it's heavy. You'd need help anyway." He gestured vaguely towards the hulking appliance. "You wouldn't want to hurt yourself." His directness, devoid of any hint of challenge or patronizing pity, struck her. It was simply a statement of objective fact. She found herself nodding, a reluctant, almost murmured, "Thank you," escaping her lips. For the next hour, they worked in a quiet, almost synchronized rhythm. Elara retrieved her large, insulated camping cooler from the utility closet, its dusty plastic smelling faintly of old campfire smoke. Kieran, with surprising strength and careful handling, helped her empty the failing refrigerator. The perishable items, already lukewarm and on the verge of spoiling, were carefully packed with the few ice packs she possessed. He even offered, with a quiet earnestness, to run to the corner store, the Grove Market on Elderberry Way, for more ice, but she declined, insisting Mr. Finch would undoubtedly have some. As they cleared the final, desolate shelves, their hands occasionally brushed against each other. Each time, a fleeting, almost imperceptible current seemed to pass between them. Not unpleasant, but a subtle tremor, a silent hum that Elara instinctively recognized as something more than accidental contact. She noticed his quick, almost immediate withdrawal, the slight stiffening of his posture, as if he too felt it and was instinctively correcting for it, re-establishing an invisible boundary. The old refrigerator, once stripped of its contents, became a formidable, inert obstacle. Kieran braced himself, instructing Elara on how to tilt it safely, how to leverage its bulk. The dull metal scraped against the worn linoleum floor as they meticulously maneuvered it out of the kitchen and into the narrow and shadowed hallway. The sound, a long drawn-out shriek, echoed eerily in the silent apartment. He strained, his young muscles bunching and flexing beneath the thin fabric of his t-shirt, a faint sheen of sweat appearing on his brow, catching the light. Elara, pushing from the back, felt the surprising warmth radiating from his body, a palpable heat that seemed to chase away the chill of her solitude. The air in the narrow passage grew thick with their combined effort, their shared, synchronized breaths. Finally, with a soft grunt of exertion from Kieran, they managed to push the monstrous appliance against the wall near the apartment door, where it stood like a mute, discarded sentinel. Kieran straightened up, running a hand through his damp, disheveled hair. "Okay, now to get a new one. Do you have a model in mind? I can look up some reviews for you tonight if you like. The Appliance Emporium usually has good deals." Elara leaned against the doorframe, a little breathless, her chest rising and falling. "I haven't even thought about it, to be honest. Just something reliable, and quickly." She looked at him, her gaze holding his, a genuine, unburdened gratitude softening her features. "You've been a tremendous help, Kieran." "I truly appreciate it." He gave a small, almost shy smile, a fleeting flash of white teeth, a rare glimpse of boyish charm. "It's fine, Ms. Thorne. Happy to help, really. He hesitated then, his gaze briefly lingering on her, a fleeting, undefinable emotion in his dark eyes, before dropping to the worn pattern of the hallway carpet. I could come back tomorrow morning? If you want to order one tonight, I can help the delivery guys bring it in. They usually just drop it at the curb, and leave it to you. The offer was even more generous, more unexpected than the last. Elara was accustomed to the impersonal efficiency of modern services, the quick transaction, the polite distance. This persistent, quiet helpfulness from a near stranger was deeply disarming. It poked at the carefully maintained edges of her solitude, inviting a subtle warmth. The thought of another day without a working refrigerator and the sheer physical effort of wrangling a new appliance into place herself, a task that now seemed Herculean, pushed her to accept. That would be incredibly helpful, Kieran. Thank you, she said, her voice softer than before, a subtle yielding in its tone. He nodded, a hint of relief, or perhaps just simple satisfaction, in his eyes. No problem. I'll just clean up a bit here. He knelt again, his movements precise, picking up stray screws, small flakes of rust, and the dust bunnies that had accumulated beneath the old appliance, meticulously placing them into a small plastic bag. As he worked, a comfortable, almost companionable silence settled between them, broken only by the faint, muffled sounds of life from the other apartments in Orchard Vista residences. Elara watched him, a slow, unfamiliar warmth spreading through her chest, a subtle thawing of the ice she'd kept around her heart for so long. It wasn't attraction in the conventional overt sense, not yet, but a feeling of unexpected connection, of a brief, shared purpose with someone who didn't ask for anything in return. He was simply there. And for the first time in a very long time, the silence of her apartment didn't feel quite so heavy, quite so oppressive. You won't believe who took his side. This is just the start. It gets stronger. The following morning, a new refrigerator, gleaming with the promise of pristine cold, sat humped awkwardly in the narrow corridor of Orchard Vista residences, an imposing stainless steel leviathan blocking the path to apartment 14B. It was a stark, almost audacious contrast to the old, ailing white unit that still slumped against the opposite wall, a ghostly relic of a bygone era. The delivery drivers, two burly men named Roland and Jebediah, had grumbled good-naturedly about the tight turns and the conspicuous absence of a service elevator as they wrestled the cumbersome appliance up the 4 flights of unforgiving stairs from their truck, parked precariously on Oakleaf Drive. Kieran, true to his quiet promise, had arrived promptly at 8, just as the rumbling delivery truck from Appliance Emporium turned onto her street. He had, with an understated but surprising authority, directed Roland and Jebediah, his youthful energy a surprising counterpoint to their weary professional efficiency. Elara had felt a distinct pang of relief, almost a palpable loosening in her chest, when she heard his gentle, familiar knock. She had slept poorly, the absence of the refrigerator's monotonous hum a noticeable, almost unsettling void, replaced by the quiet anxieties that often filled the empty hours of her nights. Her customary morning ritual, a precise choreography of brewing coffee and scanning the morning news, had felt disjointed, off-kilter. But seeing Kieran, already in motion, his presence a steady, reassuring anchor in the sudden chaos of delivery, had settled something deep within her. "Mornin', Miss Thorne," he'd said, his voice quiet, a small, polite smile playing on his lips. He wore a different t-shirt today, equally faded, but his dark hair was slightly less wild, almost tamed. they're here. Now with the new appliance blocking the entire width of the hall, the real, painstaking work began. The old refrigerator, stripped of its lifeblood, its internal mechanisms dead, felt impossibly heavier, a true dead weight. Roland and Jebediah, while undeniably skilled in their brute force approach, lacked the careful, almost intuitive patience Kieran possessed. They wanted to be in and out, their movements efficient, if a little rough. Kieran, however, moved with a deliberate gentleness, guiding the old unit out with a dancer's precision, mindful of every potential scuff mark on the freshly painted hallway walls, and then expertly maneuvering the gleaming new one into the tight, unyielding confines of the kitchen. The space was tight, the angles deceptively awkward. At one point, the new refrigerator snagged on the doorframe with a loud, protesting groan of metal and plastic. Roland swore under his breath, a low, guttural expletive. Jebediah simply pushed harder, his jaw set. "Hold on," Kieran said, his voice calm, cutting through the rising tension like a sharp blade. He knelt, assessing the precarious clearance, then began to adjust the angle of the appliance, subtly shifting its immense weight. "If you pivot here, Roland, just a hair more." And Jebediah, a little more to the right. It became immediately clear that he possessed an innate understanding of spatial mechanics, a precise, almost mathematical intuition that the delivery men, focused solely on brute force and speed, simply did not. Under his quiet, precise direction, the refrigerator, a behemoth of steel and wires, slid through the narrow opening with a surprising, almost effortless ease, settling into its designated alcove with a soft, final thud. Elara, watching from the kitchen doorway, felt a tight knot of tension she hadn't realized was there slowly unravel, dissolving into the relieved hum of the new appliance. "All right, kid," Roland grunted, wiping a streak of sweat from his brow with the back of a calloused hand. "You ever consider a career in appliance delivery logistics? You're better than most of our team, frankly." Kieran just smiled, a shy, almost embarrassed gesture, a slight flush rising on his neck. "Just trying to help." With the new refrigerator finally settled into its place, the delivery men connected it, gave it a perfunctory wipe down with a damp cloth, and had Elara sign the necessary paperwork, their movements brisk, eager to be gone. They left soon after, their heavy, echoing footsteps receding down the stairwell, leaving a sudden, almost jarring silence in their wake. The apartment, moments before a hive of activity, now felt impossibly still. Only Kieran remained, standing quietly in the middle of the kitchen, his hands resting lightly on the toolbox he'd placed on the sparkling new countertop. The new appliance hummed quietly, a low, contented purr that promised chilled food, reliable freshness, and a comforting return to a semblance of normalcy. "So that's that," Elara said, attempting to inject a lightness into her voice that she didn't quite feel. The air between them, once filled with the clatter and grunts of moving, now felt charged with something else. An unspoken understanding. A continuation of the subtle, insistent current she'd felt the day before. Kieran nodded, not looking at her directly, his gaze fixed on some indeterminate point beyond her shoulder. "Yes, it should be good to go in a few hours. Let it cool down completely before you load it up, Miss Thorne." He picked up his toolbox, the familiar click of the latch echoing loudly in the quiet room. "Well, I should probably go. Got a lecture soon at the Willowbrook Technical Institute." He was leaving. The thought, abrupt and unexpected, sent a peculiar ripple of something akin to disappointment, sharp and visceral, through Elara. She had in these brief hours grown accustomed to his quiet, competent presence, his unassuming helpfulness. The idea of the apartment returning to its previous, almost oppressive silence felt suddenly and acutely unappealing. "Kieran," she said before she could censor herself, before the ingrained habits of restraint could reassert themselves. He paused, his hand hovering over the cold metal of the doorknob, his body half turned towards the exit. "You've been incredibly generous with your time and your expertise. I can't thank you enough." He turned then, slowly, and again, their eyes met. This time, his gaze held hers for a beat longer than before, a silent, almost palpable connection. There was a vulnerability in his deep, dark eyes, a quiet openness that surprised and disarmed her. "It was nothing, Miss Thorne. Really." "Please," Elara insisted, stepping a little closer, her voice softer now, almost a whisper, laced with an unfamiliar plea. "Let me pay you for your time, for the help. I insist. It's only right." She made a tentative move towards her purse, which lay on the small antique table in the hallway. He shook his head, a faint blush creeping up his neck, dusting his cheekbones. "No, please, Mr. Finch, he's done a lot for me. Consider it a favor repaid. To him and to you." His gaze flickered around the clean, almost austere kitchen, taking in its quiet emptiness, then returned to her, holding her gaze. "Besides, I enjoy working with my hands. It's a nice change from textbooks and algorithms." His refusal, so earnest and unshakable, so utterly devoid of any pretense, disarmed her completely. She found herself at a loss for words. Most people, especially young men in his position, would jump at the chance for some extra cash. But Kieran seemed genuinely, unequivocally uninterested in payment. It was a rare, almost startling quality, and it chipped away further at her carefully constructed protective shell, revealing a softer, more exposed interior. "At least let me make you some coffee or tea," she offered, a desperate, impulsive attempt to prolong his stay, to keep the unexpected warmth he brought to her home from dissipating so quickly, so completely. "I haven't had my morning coffee yet. It's the least I can do after all your help." He hesitated, his gaze drifting towards the small, empty coffee machine on the counter, then to his wrist, where an inexpensive watch marked the passage of time. He was clearly trying to calculate the implications, the potential consequences of delaying his departure. But then a subtle shift occurred in his posture, a barely perceptible relaxation of his tense shoulders. "Okay," he said, the single word soft, almost reluctant, yet laced with a faint, almost childlike curiosity. "Just a quick one. Black, please." Elara felt a sudden, buoyant lift in her spirits, a lightness she hadn't experienced in years. "Excellent." She moved towards the coffee machine, her movement suddenly imbued with a newfound grace. As she measured out the dark, aromatic coffee grounds, the rich, comforting scent of freshly brewing coffee began to fill the kitchen, a welcome presence that had been absent for far too long. Kieran, meanwhile, leaned against the counter, his toolbox still clutched in his hand, though now it seemed less like an imminent departure and more like a quiet companion. He seemed less awkward now, more settled, his presence a natural fit in her quiet domestic space. His eyes, no longer shy, roamed around the kitchen, taking in the muted colors of the walls, the minimalist design, the lack of personal flourishes. "Nice place," he commented, his voice low, almost a murmur. "Quiet." "It is," Elara replied, pouring hot steaming water into her favorite ceramic mug, a plain, unadorned vessel that felt comforting in her hand. "Too quiet sometimes." The words slipped out before she could censor them, a small, involuntary confession, a glimpse into her meticulously guarded, solitary world. She immediately regretted the lapse, the sudden vulnerability. Kieran didn't respond directly, but she felt his gaze on her back, a warm, silent weight. When she turned, holding his freshly brewed coffee, she saw a flicker of understanding in his dark eyes. He wasn't prying, wasn't judging, wasn't seeking to exploit her small admission. He simply saw. And in that seeing, there was an unexpected depth. She handed him the mug. Their fingers brushed again, and this time the current was stronger, more insistent, a jolt that went deeper than just skin. Elara felt a distinct tremor pass through her, a familiar frisson of awareness she hadn't felt, hadn't allowed herself to feel, in years. She looked up, and his eyes, wide and dark, seemed to mirror the tremor, a silent acknowledgment of the unexpected spark. His thumb, as he finally took the mug, grazed the back of her hand, and the contact lingered for a fraction of a second longer than was necessary, longer than was polite, longer than was safe. He took a slow sip of the coffee, his gaze still holding hers, his lips barely parting from the rim of the mug. "Thank you," he murmured, his voice a little husky, a little strained, as if the single word required immense effort. The silence that followed was different from before. It was no longer merely comfortable, a quiet companion to their actions, but charged, heavy with unspoken things, with the weight of unseen currents pulling them closer. Elara felt a warmth bloom in her cheeks, a blush she hadn't experienced since her own youth. The air in the kitchen seemed to thicken, pressing in on them, amplifying the soft, almost rhythmic purr of the new refrigerator. It was an intimate, almost suffocating closeness. "So, engineering, you said?" Elara asked, desperate to break the spell, to push the conversation back to safer, more neutral ground, away from the dangerous precipice they seemed to be teetering on. Kieran nodded, pulling his gaze away from hers with visible effort, as if severing a physical connection. "Yeah, electrical engineering, though I'm more interested in automation and robotics, actually. Building complex systems." "That sounds complicated." He gave a small, almost self-deprecating laugh, a fleeting flash of genuine amusement in his eyes. "It can be, but it's fascinating, the way systems connect, the underlying logic behind everything. It's like solving an endlessly intricate puzzle." They talked then about his studies, his burgeoning ambitions, the complex intricacies of programming languages and circuit boards. Elara found herself genuinely engaged, asking questions she never thought she'd be interested in, questions that arose from a sudden, compelling curiosity. He spoke with a quiet passion, his eyes lighting up with an almost boyish enthusiasm when he described a particularly challenging project, a problem he had successfully unraveled. He was intelligent, earnest, and surprisingly eloquent when talking about his chosen field, a stark contrast to his initial shyness. And as he spoke, Elara found herself observing him again, taking in every subtle nuance. The way his brow would furrow in concentration, the subtle gestures of his long, slender hands as he explained a complex concept, the small, almost shy smiles that would appear and disappear like fleeting shadows. He seemed so open, so unburdened by the weight of the world, a stark contrast to her own carefully guarded existence, her meticulously constructed emotional walls. She, in turn, told him a little about her work as a freelance graphic designer, her clients, the quiet solitude of working from her home studio in Oakwood Lane. She carefully omitted the deeper currents of her life, the losses she had endured, the precise reasons for her guardedness, the trauma that had shaped her retreat. But even these small, mundane details felt like a significant sharing, a slow, tentative lowering of her usual defenses, a peeling back of a layer she rarely exposed. The coffee grew cold in their mugs, forgotten. The morning sun climbed higher, casting longer, more dramatic shadows across the kitchen floor, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. Neither of them seemed to notice the relentless passage of time. The initial urgency of his departure had faded, replaced by a quiet, unhurried connection, a surprising intimacy that had blossomed in the heart of her home. At one point, as he described a particularly intricate circuit detailing the flow of invisible currents, he leaned closer, gesturing to an imaginary diagram on the polished countertop. Elara found herself leaning in too, drawn by the quiet intensity of his explanation, caught in the subtle spell he cast. Their shoulders almost brushed, the soft fabric of their clothes just inches apart. The faint, clean scent of him, subtly masculine, faintly of coffee and a hint of fresh air, filled her senses. It was a comforting, almost intimate proximity, a quiet invasion of her personal space that felt entirely welcome. Suddenly, he stopped, his words trailing off, caught in the sudden, overwhelming awareness of their closeness. He looked up, his eyes meeting hers, wide and unblinking. The air in the kitchen seemed to crackle with an invisible electric charge. The quiet hum of the refrigerator, a steady, rhythmic pulse, seemed to amplify, filling the space with its low, contented thrum. Elara felt her breath catch in her throat, a sharp, involuntary gasp. The distance between them, once so clearly defined, had blurred, dissolved into something amorphous, something profound. It was no longer just a young man helping an older woman. It was something else, something undefined yet undeniably potent, a force pulling them together. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing visibly in his throat. His gaze dropped from her eyes to her lips, lingered for a fraction of a second, then quickly rose back up, a faint telltale flush darkening his cheeks, betraying his own awareness of the moment. Elara felt her own pulse quicken, a frantic drumbeat against her ribs. The tension, silent and electric, stretched between them, taut as a violin string poised to break. I really should go," he said, his voice a little strained, a little rough, abruptly breaking the fragile spell. He straightened up, putting a sudden, almost jarring distance between them. He picked up his toolbox, the movement almost an act of escape, a desperate attempt to re-establish the shattered boundaries. Elara felt a cold knot of disappointment, sharp and immediate, twisting in her gut. The connection, so fragile and unexpected, so deeply welcome, was about to be severed. She wanted to say something, anything, to keep him there, to prolong this strange, quiet intimacy that had bloomed so unexpectedly. But no words came. Her throat felt tight, constricted. He walked towards the door, his movements more hurried now, as if trying to outrun the profound silence they had created, the unspoken weight of their shared moment. What happens now, no one expected. But it's what restores fairness. Kieran reached the door, his hand hovering over the cold, brushed metal of the knob. The silence in the apartment after his polite, almost desperate declaration felt impossibly vast, broken only by the steady, reassuring hum of the new refrigerator from the kitchen. Elara stood frozen, watching him, a bewildering knot of confusion and a peculiar, aching vulnerability tightening in her chest. She had wanted him to stay, had felt that fragile, burgeoning connection deep in her core, a sensation she hadn't experienced in years, but now he was leaving, and the familiar, unforgiving walls of her solitude seemed to be closing in again, more suffocating, more profoundly isolating than before. He turned, his back still partially to her, his shoulders tense, a rigid line against the soft light filtering through the hallway window. Thank you again, Miss Thorne, for the coffee and for everything." His voice was low, almost a whisper, laden with something she couldn't quite decipher. Was it regret? A profound sense of relief at his escape? Or something else entirely? Elara found her voice, though it was little more than a breathy murmur, a fragile sound in the immense quiet. "Kieran, wait." He paused, his hand dropping from the doorknob, but he didn't turn back fully. He stood there, a tall, slender silhouette against the muted light, his stillness amplifying the electric tension in the air. He was a creature caught between two worlds, the practical demands of his schedule and the undeniable, unspoken pull in the room. Elara took a hesitant step forward, then another, the soft soles of her slippers making no sound on the polished wooden floor. The distance between them, once a mere few feet, felt like an insurmountable chasm, a vast emotional expanse. You don't have to rush off," she said, her voice thin, betraying her sudden, overwhelming desperation. "It's still early. Your lecture can wait a few minutes." He finally turned slowly, as if against an invisible current, his dark eyes meeting hers. There was a raw, unvarnished honesty in their depths, a directness that made her breath catch, made her heart pound a frantic rhythm. He looked as conflicted, as profoundly uncertain, as vulnerable as she felt. I really should go. My lecture is important, and—" He trailed off, his gaze dropping to her lips again, lingering for a fraction of a second, then sweeping over her face, holding steady on her eyes, searching, questioning. "This isn't— I shouldn't impose any further on your time." "You're not imposing," Elara countered, her voice gaining a surprising strength, a quiet resolve she hadn't known she possessed. "You've been nothing but incredibly helpful, Kieran, and I enjoyed our conversation more than you know." The words felt utterly inadequate, a pale, almost pathetic reflection of the deeper, tumultuous current that had pulsed between them, the connection that had solidified in the quiet intimacy of her kitchen. He took a slow, deep breath, his young chest rising and falling visibly. I think I should go, Miss Thorne." His voice was firm now, an almost desperate resolve clinging to its tone. It was a polite but unequivocal dismissal, a gentle yet unyielding closing of the door. He was asserting the boundaries they both implicitly understood, the unspoken societal rules that governed their interaction. He was too young, barely on the cusp of his own life. She was too old, burdened by hers. There was in the logical, rational world no place for this unspoken tension, this burgeoning, forbidden current. He was trying to protect them both, to retreat to the safety of what was allowed. As he spoke, he reached for the doorknob again, his long fingers wrapping around the cool, impersonal metal. He was going. The reality of it hit Elara with a surprising, almost physical force, a dull, aching emptiness blooming in her chest. The quiet warmth he had brought into her carefully insulated world, the fleeting sense of connection, of being truly seen, was about to vanish, leaving her with the familiar, chilling embrace of her own company. The solitude, she knew, would feel even heavier now, more profound in its return. A sudden, fierce, almost reckless impulse surged through her, overriding years of carefully constructed reserve, a lifetime of holding herself apart. It was a desperate, almost primal need to cling to the fragile thread that had so unexpectedly woven itself into her solitary existence. She didn't think, didn't rationalize, didn't weigh the consequences. She simply acted, propelled by a force she barely understood. "I said I was leaving," he began, his hand turning the knob, the faint metallic click echoing loudly in the hushed, pregnant silence of the hallway. He was looking at the door, his body already anticipating the outward motion, preparing to step through, to sever the connection entirely. In that precise, suspended instant, Elara took a single, decisive step forward. Her hand, acting entirely of its own volition, reached out, not to grasp him, not to pull him back, but to push the heavy oak door shut. With a soft, resonant thud, it closed, sealing them within the quiet, almost claustrophobic confines of her apartment, severing his escape route, closing off the world outside. The sharp click of the latch, so final, was a stark, almost violent punctuation mark in the profound silence. Kieran froze, his hand still on the knob, his body half turned towards the door, poised for departure. He slowly, almost imperceptibly, turned his head, a deliberate, almost cinematic motion. His dark eyes, now wide and unblinking, met hers. Confusion flickered across their depths, then a dawning understanding, a flicker of surprise, and beneath it all, a nascent, almost terrified recognition. Elara was breathless, her heart pounding a frantic, desperate rhythm against her ribs, a drum beat in the stillness. The sheer audacity of her action, so utterly out of character, so impulsive, stunned even herself. But now that the door was closed, a strange, exhilarating sense of calm settled over her, quiet and profound. The decision was made. The moment was hers to hold, to shape, or to let shatter into a million pieces. She took another step, closing the small remaining gap between them. Her gaze locked with his, unwavering, fiercely direct. The air around them seemed to thrum with a palpable, invisible energy, a silent conversation far more profound, more revealing than any words could ever convey. She could see the faint tremor in his hands, still resting on the doorknob, the slight parting of his lips as if he were trying to draw breath. He was as surprised, as vulnerable, as utterly exposed as she was. "Too late," Elara whispered, her voice barely audible, a fragile thread of sound in the immense, profound silence of the hallway. It was not a statement of malice or control, no veiled threat, but a raw, honest confession, an admission of her own unexpected need, her own unacknowledged yearning, her profound, buried loneliness. It was an acknowledgment that the lines had blurred, that the carefully constructed boundaries had been crossed, not by force, not by overt action, but by the quiet, inevitable pull that had grown, unseen and undeniable, between them. Her eyes searched his, a silent plea for understanding, for acceptance, for a shared recognition of the moment's gravity. She saw a multitude of emotions flicker across his young face. Apprehension, uncertainty, a hint of fear, a glimmer of shock. But beneath it all, a deep resonant echo of her own unspoken desire, a mirror of her own burgeoning feeling. His gaze dropped to her lips, lingered for an agonizing moment, then rose to her eyes again, holding hers in a silent, intense communion that spoke volumes without a single word. He didn't speak. He didn't move away, didn't try to push past her, didn't attempt to open the door again. He simply stood there, his hand still resting on the doorknob, but his body now turned fully towards her, his posture less about escape, and more about a quiet, stunned presence. The silence stretched, elongated, filled with the unspoken weight of what had just happened, what had been irrevocably set in motion. It was a pivotal moment, a dizzying precipice from which they could either fall back into the deceptive safety of their separate, carefully curated lives, or step forward, together, into something entirely unknown, entirely forbidden. Elara felt the trembling start in her fingertips, a subtle vibration that spread rapidly through her entire body, a potent mixture of fear and a strange, exhilarating defiance. She had laid herself bare, exposed a vulnerability she had long kept meticulously hidden, buried beneath layers of composure. And, in his profound silence, in the steady, unwavering intensity of his dark gaze, she found a glimmer of something akin to hope, a fragile, trembling promise that was far more potent than any spoken word. The faint, comforting scent of brewing coffee still lingered in the air, mixed now with something else. A clean, almost electric scent that seemed to emanate directly from him, the subtle aroma of his youth. The quiet hum of the new refrigerator, a sound of mundane, reassuring normalcy, served as a surreal, almost ironic counterpoint to the profound, almost spiritual shift that had just occurred in the narrow confines of the hallway. She watched his eyes, her own heart pounding, waiting. The decision was no longer hers alone. It was in his hands now, in his response, in the silent language of his gaze. And as the seconds stretched into an eternity, each one heavy with anticipation, she saw the subtle shift in his expression, the faint relaxation of his previously tense shoulders,